Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to Focus on Food. This is the fifth webinar produced by Les Dames d'Escoffier, Washington, D.C. chapter in our summer series. But my name is Drew Faulkner, and I'm the current treasurer of the organization. Before we get into the main event that you've all registered for, I wanted to take a moment and just talk to you a bit about who we are and what we do as a chapter. Les Dames d'Escoffier DC is a 501c3 organization comprised of professional women in food, fine beverage, and hospitality, focused on education and philanthropy. Washington, D.C. is the second oldest and second largest chapter in Les Dames d'Escoffier. There are now currently 45 chapters of Les Dames around the globe. We have chapters in United States, Canada, Mexico, England, and France. I want to express thank you again for everyone who is attending, and particular thanks to those of you who pushed the donate button. Again, nothing is too small. We appreciate every donation. And without further ado, I'd like to pass on to Dame Abba Kwawu. Abba will be moderating our session. Take it away, Abba.
I'm a brand new member of Les Dames d'Escoffier, and this is my first job, my first mission, so bear with me. We're here this afternoon for the Focus on Food webinar today, and many of us have been at home, and we have all been baking sourdough bread, so I hear, making jam, and figuring out how to share photos with our friend as we're all kind of isolated at home and looking to connect by sharing photos. I know I am guilty of not always taking the most delicious looking photos. And so I'm excited today to have some real professionals to teach us a little bit about that. So before we begin, I just wanted to say, what is food styling? What does a food stylist actually do? Food stylists do not often take the photos, but today we have a treat with some people who do it all. A food stylist is responsible for making food appear as perfect as possible for the photographers who are shooting it, or for some of those of us who are consuming it via Instagram or in books or on the web. Food stylists work both with photographers, art directors. They coordinate amazing shots by plating the meals and arranging amazing shots and making the food look their absolute best. Some food stylists prepare and cook the food, as we're going to hear from some of our guests today, our panelists today. Food stylists can be featured in places such as cookbooks, movies, TV shows. We've all seen those commercials while we've been at home, magazines, and promotional photo shoots. So today we're going to really dig deep and learn more about the world of food styling from three amazing members of Les Dames. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce you to Nancy Baggett, Danielle Turner, and Deb Lindsey. Hi, ladies.
Hi there.
Great to see all of your faces, even though in a tiny little square on Zoom. It still feels good to be connected this way. So we have many participants today. I think we had about 160 people coming in to join us for this chat today. So I'm looking to you guys to make us really, really hungry and teach us a lot about food styling and photography. So I'd love to introduce you first to Nancy. Nancy Baggett has authored many food articles and numerous beautifully illustrated cookbooks. She'll tell us all about that today. And she's been published many times over, and her All-American Cookie Cookbook and Simply Sensational Cookies received the IACP and James Beard Cookbook Award nominations. Congrats to you. Her International Chocolate Cookie Cookbook won an IACP Best Baking Book Award. Nancy began her focus on DIY food photography more than a decade ago, with the goal of learning to prop, style, and shoot photos of her own recipes for her Facebook and blog, and ultimately for a cookbook she had in mind. This culminated in her award-winning, enthusiastically received, self-published 2016 work, The Art of Cooking with Lavender. which garnered a Books for Better Living award from the independent publisher. So welcome, Nancy. We cannot wait to hear more about you and your wonderful photography and cooking. Chef Danielle Turner is with us today. Beautiful food is a way of life for Chef Danielle Turner. Her food styling career has spanned 15 years, and it includes styling food for cookbooks, magazines, numerous television segments, cooking demonstrations, satellite media tours, and videos. Chef Danielle was the food stylist for season 1 and 2 of the James Beard honored PBS series Patty's Mexican Table, and hosted by Patty Janich, and she has worked with the freelance food stylist for the Food Network as well. Her food styling tips have been featured in Women's World magazine. So welcome, Chef Danielle. We cannot wait to learn a lot from you today. At least I know I'm ready. And then Lindsey is a food photographer. Food photography has been a more recent career path for Deb, who started as a photojournalist for a chain of suburban newspapers. After several years of being behind the camera, she made the switch to management and was a photo editor for the Washington Post for 17 years. She started her freelance business in 2007 and left the Post in 2010 to photograph primarily weddings and events. Food assignments now make up a good portion of the work she does, including editorial work on a regular basis for the Washington Post and Bethesda Magazine, and for restaurants and catering companies in the DC area. So welcome, Deb. So all of our guests who have joined us so far, just a couple quick things I want to share with you before we dig into the conversation. We are going to have 3 separate presentations from our panelists today. And then after that, we'll get into a Q&A where you can pose all of your questions. So I'm depending on you to ask some really smart questions. Use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, please, to submit your questions, and we'll do our best to get to as many of them as possible when we all come back together. And then quickly, I'd like to share with you, would love for you to continue to engage with us on Instagram and on social media. So Les Dames DC, you can find us there at LESDAMESDC. You can find Nancy at Nancy_Baggett, BAGGETT. Danielle, you can find it at Chef Danielle Turner. And Deb, you can find it at Deb Lindsey, LINDSEY, on social media. So please engage with us and use that question, that Q&A button at the bottom. So we'll start first with you, Nancy, and dig into your background as a food stylist. So ladies, Deb and Danielle, I'll come back to you in a few minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for joining us, everybody. I was working in strictly food photography, food recipe development. I worked as hard as I could over many years. That was my career up until 2007, and things began to change because the iPhone came on the scene. And from that time on, I went, oh, everything is gravitating to the web. If I have recipes I want to post, I got to have a pic or no one will be interested. That's why I got into DIY food photography. And let me just go ahead to the video now. This will show you where I went from the beginning to hopefully some photography that will make you feel like you could do it too. And so I'm going to share right now my presentation, which is called DIY food photography. Hi there, I'm Nancy Baggett. I'm a cookbook author, and if you are as interested in DIY food photography as I am, you've come to the right place. I got my beginning because I was very fortunate to work on cookbooks over the years that had beautiful photography. And the publishers allowed me, in many cases, to come and work on the shoot. So I got to be involved in what was going on. If you see a shot going by of a chocolate book, I was back there in the kitchen making the chocolate leaves. And we actually won an award, a Baking Book of the Year award for that book.
Anyway, long story short, I decided I really needed to learn how to do my own photography, and I was willing to get busy learning propping and styling and shooting, and it's not easy. My goal was, of course, to create better pictures for my blog and Facebook and Instagram and stories that I was writing that I needed the recipes photographed for. So I got busy. My ultimate objective was to get good enough that I could do the photography for a cookbook of my own. And I'm happy to say that about 5 years ago, I felt like I was getting good enough, and I began shooting the photography for the book right here, The Art of Cooking with Lavender. I'm really thrilled. People like it. They like the photography, so it makes me very happy. So today, I thought we'd start with the basics. What kind of camera you need, some basic, very basic do's and don'ts. And then in the future, I'll come back and do some follow-up videos so as I get time on more details. For example, does it matter what kind of backgrounds you use? Oh, absolutely. Does it matter what kind of plates you use? Absolutely. And we'll come back and talk about that. But today, let's begin by talking about what kind of camera you need. You need a DSLR. Most cameras today are DSLR. I have a Nikon 3200, and I use a 40 millimeter lens, which works. The 40 millimeter lens works really well for food. I use it a lot. What else do you need? Well, you need a tripod, because in addition to making sure that your focus is better by shooting with it nice and still, it helps you to see better. One of the things that's interesting is that you learn gradually to see what the camera sees. You won't see it originally, but you'll get better at it. But what you want to do is shoot, then take the card out, go look on a bigger format at what you'd shot, and then come back and make adjustments. And if you have the tripod set up, you can do that very easily. Another thing that you need to do is shoot raw, camera raw. There is a setting, if you don't know how to find it, get out the book and figure it out, or ask somebody. It's really important. That will mean the camera will give you the largest amount of information that it can. You can later, with your post-processing software, I use Adobe Elements. What else do you need? You need to be able to learn how to focus. Here's a good point. You need to learn to shoot without flash. You're seeing one of my early images. It's very horrible. I'm embarrassed to show you, but you have to start somewhere. Not only is it terribly out of focus, but I shot with flash. It too harsh, destroys the potential beauty of the food. Focusing actually is more complex and need to take more time thinking about it than you might expect. Shot one here shows a bowl of soup, an early pick of mine, and the surface of the soup should be the star, and it's completely out of focus. So that is a failed shot. Number two here is buttercream swirled cookies, and you can see that only one buttercream swirl is in focus. The other two are not. They all should be. The bigger problem, however, is that the styling is not good enough. You should be able to see pretty swirls, and they are not pretty. So that shot shows that you can't take a good pic if the styling is improper to begin with. Number three here may look, it's a bowl of vegetables, and it may look fine. The problem is that the point of focus is actually up near the utensil, the broccoli. That doesn't make any sense. You need to be sure that you know how to control the point of focus. And again, it's in the book. If you need to learn that, take some time to examine how to set the point of focus. It makes the difference of being a professional looking shot or not. In this picture, the point of focus should be probably the food on the end of the fork. As you can see, it's completely blurry. Now, I mentioned that shooting with flash is a terrible thing to do. Well, what do you do instead? I suggest natural light. Particularly afternoon light is very beautiful. If you can set up your schedule that you can shoot, not talking direct sunlight, but if you can shoot afternoon light, it's very mellow, it's very warm, it gives the food a beautiful glow, makes it more appetizing. So take advantage of the opportunity if you have it. So I want to wrap with a couple quick tips that are a little more advanced, things for you to start thinking about in the future. One of the things that will give you some really beautiful looks to your work, almost a magical quality, if you're shooting a liquid and it happens to be translucent or transparent and you can shoot it in glass, you're going to get some great effects. Backlighting so that the light comes through the liquid, and then also, of course, front lighting so that you show everything that needs to show. Here are some examples. I actually took a course from a guy who specialized in beverages, and he talked about the fact that if it has an effervescence, this particular recipe does. It's called lavender ginger lime cooler. That's why I use lime in the shot, and you see some lavender in the shot, and you can see that those bubbles show up very well. It's really important to take advantage of it. Also, if the light can come through the ice cubes, he was very emphatic about the value of using pretty ice cubes. Something to think about there. One last tip I want to give you is to start thinking about how you can frame your pics a bit. Here's a plate that I really like, and you might be thinking, I use this quite a bit, and you might be thinking, oh, because it's white. Well, actually, the fact that it's white is great. Photographers know, and chefs know too, that white makes food pop. But another reason is that it's rectangular. And here's a shot that I did, which shows you that I wanted to provide a little bit of a frame, a little bit of structure for the picture, but I didn't want to make it overly noticeable. So here you have the cupcakes. I wanted it to say beautiful cupcakes with great glaze. I wanted those to be the stars of the show, and I didn't want the frame to overpower, and it worked very well. So start thinking about other trays and dishes that you can use to add order to your pics. That's really a function of a composition, and that is another whole lesson, and we'll talk about in the future. So now I'm going to wrap. I can tell you it will be really gratifying. Practice, practice, practice. Realize that it does take time to get better, but that it's really, really gratifying and empowering to be able to shoot your own work. So I will be coming back soon, and please join me again. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for that, and for being so transparent and showing us where you began and where you are now. It shows that there's hope for the rest of us. So thank you so much. And we will come back to you, as I said, with the discussion at the end. So thank you. I'm going to invite Chef Danielle on with us. There you are.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi.
I will let you take it away.
All right. Thank you. Well, hi, virtual friends. I'm so excited to be in the company of other people, even if it is just through a computer screen. But I'm really excited to share some of the food styling tips that I have learned over the past 15 years. I was trained at culinary school as a chef at l'Académie de Cuisine, but I had zero food styling experience when I landed my first food styling gig, which just happened to be for the Food Network. So these are just a few things I wish I had known back then. But before I get into the slides, I just want to point out that food styling for TV is slightly different than styling for cookbooks and photographs, mainly because in addition to making the food look great, you have so many other things to take into consideration, like timing, having multiple versions of your recipe available in various stages of completion, to making sure you have working food, which is the food that will actually be used during the segment. And all of that has to look good as well. So let's get into it. All right, so food styling tips for TV. My first advice is choose the right recipe. Now, if you're hired to style a segment for a chef or a PR company, they will likely have chosen the recipe for you. But when you are in a position to choose, you want to know that it's not about choosing the most popular recipe or your favorite recipe. It's about choosing the best recipe for the format. So the amount of time you're going to have for your segment can vary anywhere from 2 to 5 minutes, and that can change at the very last minute if there's breaking news. So you want to choose a recipe that can easily be assembled in 2 minutes if that's all you have, but also one that can be stretched if you end up having more time. One way I like to deal with that is to choose recipes that require minimal styling. I like to do my best to take advantage of the natural beauty that food has, so I always choose recipes with lots of color. These next few slides that I'm going to show you are examples of what a beauty shot, which is that perfectly plated dish the camera zooms in on at the end of your segment, is called. But this is how they might look. And this is one aspect of food styling where for television that you're doing very much the same thing that you're doing for photographs. So again, dishes that are naturally pretty, lots of bright colors, the fewer ingredients, the better for television. If you're working with foods that are dark or dull in color, these are mushrooms and beans. Fresh herbs are a great way to brighten them up. I think white plates are magical in their ability to make food pop, so I tend to use those more often than not. But I also really love the look of richly colored wooden cutting boards. The goal, whatever your surface is to highlight the food's natural beauty so there's less work that you have to do with it. And I always like the focus to be on the food and not necessarily your props. You also want to focus on recipes that have lots of tasks in them. So chopping, stirring, piping, if you're decorating or baking. These are things that the host can do while you're talking them through the recipe. This is a pic from a back to school sandwich segment that we did. And because we had all the ingredients laid out, it was easy for the host to just jump in and start assembling their own sandwiches. Well, that was another shot of a New Year's Eve segment, but same philosophy where we had everything set out for the lettuce cups and it was very easy for her to jump in to help. Next tip, set the scene. Once you have your recipe, you have to think about how it will show up in the segment. You always need a beauty shot, which we just looked at, but you will also need other versions of your recipe. For example, if your recipe has multiple steps, you likely won't have time to go through all of them as you would if you were cooking them at home. So you might have all the ingredients prepared to start and then have a finished version. Think of how on cooking shows, when they put one dish into the oven, there's one already there ready to come out. When you are the food stylist, you are the magic of television that makes that happen. So I like to start with all of the ingredients in bowls. They're prepped, they're ready to go. If you've worked in a professional kitchen, you know this is called your mise en place. This is what we call also our working food, which is the food that will be used during your demo. This is back to the sandwich segment. There's a couple things. Again, we had all the sandwich ingredients laid out, so it was easy for them to assemble, but this is a perfect example of how you have to think about different things when you're under TV lights. The two stainless steel knives, every nook or nick and scratch is made very, very obvious by the lights, and that's something that you might not necessarily have a problem with for a photo shoot. Again, more from the sandwich spread. This is actually video of a cookbook segment that we did where she was demoing one of the recipes from her book. And you can see we have all of her ingredients set up. She's gonna sear that fish there in that pan. But we also have down at the other end behind the lines, you'll see we have 2 fillets that are already seared. So that all she has to do is garnish that at the end because again, we didn't have time to, there we go. Okay. This is what's called a wide shot. And that's the shot that before you actually start to cook where the camera will pan out and show your whole scene. And this is why it's important to set the scene. I always purchase extras of ingredients, especially if they're colorful, to use to decorate the rest of the workspace. And here's why. So this is a wide shot of a Valentine's Day segment. So there's lots of red, colorful ingredients, candy. You want the entire space to look welcoming and full of color, but it also needs to be functional as well. This side shot shows you that behind all the pretty stuff, we have everything that we're going to need to cook. Veggies are in the bowl, fish is already wrapped in parchment, our utensils are ready to go in the mason jar. This is a shot from what's called an SMT or satellite media tour, and it's where they film multiple segments or interviews with news stations across the country in one day. So you set your space up and your food sits for hours, and then you obviously refresh it as needed. This one is relatively simple because it's beverages, but we are taking full advantage of all the colors of the fruits and the drinks to liven it up. And the set is basically filled with beauty shots if you zoom in. So here we're just using the fruit to mirror the colors of the juice. Fresh fruit is always beautiful. This is back to the back to school sandwich segment where we're talking about setting the scene and filling out the space. The client requested that we use their packaging in the segment. So I just added some schoolish themed items to round it out. Apples, little chalkboard action, books, notes from mom and dad. I highly recommend doing a practice setup at home. This is a setup of a Halloween segment that I did. And you can see we've got everything laid out. When you do your setup at home, snap a picture of it. That will come in handy as a reference tool when you get to the station where you might have only 5 minutes to set up and you need a quick reference of how you like things. But you can see we started taking the labels off of the can. Some clients will ask you to do that, others won't. For us, it was just easier to leave the ingredients in their cans and then we made our own labels. And this is how that all looked on set. You can see on the left, we used a black tablecloth, lots of spider webbing and candy. It's really important to make it look full and inviting. Costumes are optional. And lastly, I want to talk about the importance of color and contrast. I talk a lot about using white plates, but it's also more important that you pick a plate that's going to contrast with whatever your table coloring is. These are shots from a shoot about kiwi. So we left those stickers on. Normally I would take those off, but they had the brand's name on them. I used placemats to contrast with the table covering. This was a unique instance where the person who was going to be talking about the kiwi was talking about other products as well. So I styled one end of the table and then she kind of added her other products down at the other end. But again, the placemats really help pop against the yellow tablecloth. Always iron your tablecloth. You can see the wrinkles there. And last step, these are photos from a segment we did for Outback Steakhouse, where the chef from the restaurant actually brought the prepared food to the set. So there was not a lot of food styling to be done. Sometimes flexibility and patience will be the most valuable tools in your food styling kit when you're in a situation where you don't have total control over the food. So again, lots of white plates. We added bowls of the spices that they used for color. There's some tomatoes in the back. And fresh produce, it's nice and shiny and give it a wash, is always a great way to add color and to help fill out a set. And this is a wide shot of how it all looked together. So again, got the cutting boards offering some different surfaces and some texture and a little bit of height. But again, he was able to, he wasn't cooking, but he was talking about the food, so he was able to point and reach to them relatively easily. So those are my tips. I hope you find that helpful. And again, these are just things I wish I'd known before my first styling gig.
Danielle, thank you so much for sharing that. You know, as a publicist, I'm like, I need to talk to you a lot for when we're going into TV segments, because it certainly is something, you know, that happens so quickly, as you mentioned. So you need to be prepared and be very, very creative. So
absolutely.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And we're now going to speak with Lindsey. About food styling and photography. Hi, Deb. I will let you take it away from here.
Hi, I'm Deb. I'm going to share some photos of mine and talk about my approach to food photography. I didn't start as a food photographer. I was a photojournalist and then a photo editor at the Washington Post. When I left the Post to run my freelance business as a wedding photographer, one of my first regular gigs was to come back to the Post and photograph dishes for the food section. So basically, I learned food photography on the job. I had to use artificial light almost from the beginning to make the food look good. We worked in a tiny space, in a closet, in a basement, so there was no natural light to be found. After a few years, I started to get regular assignments to take photos for dining reviews. Almost immediately, I realized how much I loved it. It was creative problem solving in an unfamiliar atmosphere, very similar to what I did when I was a photojournalist. And there was food. Being a food photographer is a seriously cool job. I get to go to lots of fun, buzzy places, like Call Your Mother, one of my personal favorites. And though mostly I work by myself, I get a lot of people offering to come with me to assist. Or at least that's how it was before the pandemic hit. Dining out today doesn't look anything like it did 3 months ago. In my work for the Post, I get to cover the DC dining scene as it evolves into its ever-changing new normal. The first restaurant that I photographed when this hit was Crazy Steve's in Silver Spring, and it was pretty surreal. It was my first time shooting with a mask, and the empty tables in what should have been a busy place really felt ominous. Mostly what I photographed the first couple months was takeout food in black plastic containers. It's a little hard to get creative when all the food is plated in the same shiny boxes, and generally carry-out food is designed to be practical rather than visually appealing, with probably an exception for sushi, which is what's pictured here. Assignments now are starting to get back to normal a little bit, where people are eating outside. But I can't tell you how happy I was to photograph my first chef-plated dish on a real plate in 3 months. These pictures were taken at Clarity in Vienna on June 1st. And in particular, I was really fond of this chef portrait of Chef John Crin. He was an early adopter to dining outside. He totally flipped his fine dining restaurant into the parking lot adjacent to his building. The picture of him wearing the mask, the servers with their protective gear, taking plates to diners, just told the story. And when I'm working, particularly when I'm working for a news outlet, I'm looking for pictures that are going to tell a story. Another way I do that is to put the dishes within context of the restaurant. So on the left is a picture from an Afghani restaurant, and on the right is a picture from a Cuban restaurant. Doing food photography on the fly, rather than having a well thought out plan or a food stylist or a creative director, means a lot of thinking on my feet, which is actually kind of my favorite thing to do. So this picture was taken at the Shack. It's a tiny restaurant about 2.5 hours away from DC. The food is beautiful, but the decor in the restaurant is pretty sparse. So I found this was the host stand, so we cleared it off. I loved the weathered wood, the colors in that sort of mimic the colors in the dish, plus having a non-reflective blue plate just made it a really soft picture. And this is kind of what I'm looking for when I go into a restaurant. I'm looking for various locations where I can photograph the food and make it really look good. So when I arrive at a restaurant, I don't know what I have a list of what I'm going to photograph, but I don't know how the food is going to be presented. I have names of dishes and the type of cuisine. I don't know what the light's going to be, so I always bring my own. The case here on the left was taken at Ellie. This was a natural light picture, just a whitewashed brick wall behind it, beautiful cake, hard to miss. Picture on the right, I knew immediately I wanted to use this location. I saw the orange chair against the blue wall outside at Evening Star in Alexandria, and I just thought that would really make the food pop, and it did. Now, I could get an idea about what the food looks like at a restaurant by looking at its social media or at the website, but I really prefer not to. That way I can come into it with a totally fresh eye. So obviously, if roast chicken is on my list of dishes to photograph, which it often is, I know what that looks like. So it's a challenge to find new ways to shoot it. But when I have on my list an abalone appetizer served on seaweed and dry ice in its shell, I don't really know what to expect, but it made a really cool picture, and dry ice makes everything pretty interesting. And I'm definitely a happy camper when I walk into some place and I see colors and patterns and textures and even a cool floor that I can work with. So when I'm shooting for a news outlet, I have to make sure that I have pictures that will work together well. At the Post, they'll run an online gallery that'll be 5 or 6 pictures, or even if it's a layout for a newspaper or magazine, all the pictures, there needs to be a mix. They can't all be overhead. They can't all be lit the same. They can't all be horizontal. So my goal is to mix it up. In this case, these pictures were taken at Brothers and Sisters. Picture on the left is an octopus hot dog. And the picture on the right is a bread bowl filled with chowder. These were 2 of maybe about 8 pictures that I submitted from this restaurant, and you can tell they have a very different look. I also always need to get a picture, almost always need to get a picture of a chef or an owner. I don't usually have a ton of time to spend with them, so I'm always looking for something that sort of shows off a little of their personality as well as something from the restaurant. Now let's talk about light. Light is the first thing that I'm looking for when I walk in. So if I see something like this, I'm very happy. So great window light is important, but it's not the final word for me. I actually do shoot a lot of food with flash. I use a Magmod softbox and a Profoto B10 flash head, if there's any photo nerds out there. I'm also a fan of directional light. So I like my photos to have some depth and texture. So I often shoot with the light to the side or behind the subject to help give that. Particularly when I'm using backlighting, actually would be my third most important piece of equipment is my reflector. So I'm going to show you a little bit about how I do a natural light setup and then how I do a flash setup. So in this case, the light is off to the left of the picture, subject in the middle, the cherries, and my reflector is just an 8x10 piece, heavy duty white cardboard with a little spring clamp that I attach to the end. So it'll stand up on its own. Total cost of that is maybe about $5. So what happens is the light hits the subject, hits the bounce card, the white card there, and reflects back into the cherries. This picture on the left is before the white card is out. The picture on the right is using the reflection, and you can see there's little highlights and pops of light in there that you don't see in the original picture. When I'm set up for flash, same thing. This is my softbox on the left. I have a dish of crab soup in the middle and the reflectors on the right. And what that produces, the picture on the left is without the reflector, and you can see in the bottom right of the picture, it's very dark, the shadow that's cast there. Once I put the reflector in for the shot on the right, it brightens it right up. This was another picture from Brothers and Sisters where I use that same lighting setup in the field. It's lit heavily from the back and the left. I had my white card as close as possible to it in order to bring in some detail to the front of this amazing looking cheesecake. Flash is also very helpful for brown food. One of the other advantages to using my flash setup is that I can roam around the restaurant, use different textures, different surfaces. I'm not stuck in the front of the restaurant shooting with the only window that's there. And sometimes I just luck into an exquisitely plated couple dishes of food. This is from a place called Chef Guo's in Annandale. It's a very nondescript building behind an Exxon station, and they specialize in imperial Chinese cuisine. And yes, that is dry ice on the picture on the left. I get asked a lot what my favorite thing to shoot is, and it's probably a toss-up between cocktails and desserts. As Nancy mentioned, glassware and colorful drinks can make for some really pretty pictures. Dessert is always visually appealing. In this case, this is kind of a perfect storm for me. Dessert, reflection, I'm always looking for reflections, and a nice clean background. And I do love a good pouring shot. Doesn't necessarily have to be for dessert, but this was a chocolate souffle in a restaurant in Georgetown that was just perfect and elegant, and it smelled amazing. The still picture doesn't quite do that justice, but, and another reflection, this was taken at Spoken English down in Adams Morgan. It's a upside down reflection of a mural in the stopper of a Japanese whiskey bottle. So always looking for reflections. So I've got a few tips that might be helpful. First tip, always look for the light. This was a shot I found at Mama Chang's in Fairfax. I was waiting for scene pictures of people eating, and the light just happened to hit this one table. And I noticed that the steam from the bowl coming up was just beautifully backlit. And I actually liked that this picture was sort of messy and not perfectly arranged. I thought the light makes it. And using a window, you can just take a bowl of fruit. You can, this is a really easy setup to replicate at home. Use the light, look for the light wherever you go. Number 2, move your position. Some food looks great overhead, but how many pizzas can you really photograph that way? Some of my favorite pizza pictures have actually been taken from different angles. So get higher, get lower, move around the dish, see if there's maybe a different or better angle. This is my low angle pizza shot that I like. Tip number 3, they're only the best way to photograph a hamburger is from the side, almost always. And if you're going to do it, make sure it's the best looking hamburger you can find. Tip number 4, get in close. Don't be afraid to get tight. Sometimes you want to see a whole plate, but sometimes the plate can be distracting from a truly beautiful dish. This is actually not a dish, but a condiment. This is Peter Chang's red chili oil. And I just love the colors and the textures to this one. And my last tip is try the obvious shot and then try something else. It may not work, but if it does, you'll have something special. This is another picture from the shack. I photographed the chef in his tiny kitchen cooking, and I really didn't love the picture. So I had always planned to go outside and take an overall shot, an exterior, because it's literally this one-room restaurant. And so I went out at dusk. I looked across, I stood across the street, and I looked through the front door, and I could see the chef cooking at his kitchen. And to me, that was the picture. So the biggest thing that I've learned in 30 years of photography is that it's always changing. The concepts are the same: lighting, focus, aperture, all the choices that you make, but the technology and styles are evolving. So I'm constantly learning. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Deb, for sharing that. I am really hungry right now. And I see in the chat section that several of you are also really hungry after watching these presentations. So I'm going to ask Nancy and Danielle to also turn on your video and join us. Thank you again, ladies, for your presentations. And it was really great to hear about food styling and photography from your 3 unique perspectives. So guys, please keep using that Q&A button and we'll get to your questions in a moment. It was really interesting to hear about how each of you got your start in food photography. And I'm interested to know how your previous experience really informs your approach to food styling today. For instance, Nancy, you talked about having watched and observed, food stylists on shoots and having the need to shoot your own photography of your own work. How did that come as you baking and being a home cook really inform your approach to food styling?
Oh, very much. I worked with some great photographers and stylists on a number of shoots, and I didn't even really realize that they coordinated together. And on most shoots, it's not a one-man band or a one-woman band. And they would say, and the photographer would say to me, "Oh, well, we're going to shoot the so-and-so cookies tomorrow. Can you make sure that you use Christmassy icing?" So I used some sprinkles, silver sprinkles and green in the background to suggest that it was Christmassy. And so they would tell me kind of what they had in mind. And one of the things that I did observe is when you're not the photographer or the stylist, try not to impose your vision. On a couple of shots on the chocolate book, I said, well, I saw the neatest chocolate shop when I was in Austria, and I'd like to create the front window. And the photographer had no vision of what I had seen, and I had no picture. And so his vision was not mine. You have to allow their vision to work when they're in charge, and then you have to have your own vision. So I learned a lot of tips that, well, one thing they said is, and this was for anybody who wants to do a cookbook, you have to plan ahead. Like if it's a cookie book, not every shot can be brown. That's a problem right there. Or if you're doing a lavender book, you can't have a sprig of lavender on every single plate. So what do? Sometimes you have a napkin that has lavender on it, or maybe the folder that goes with the luncheon has lavender on it. In any case, you have to plan that as a whole. So it was just fun to learn what they did. And a lot of it was technical because I learned, for example, I had always had the image that you were shooting in this massive area. And a lot of times you'd go, the studio would be big, but they would be working on a 12-inch to 15-inch square, and that's where the tablecloth or whatever and the backgrounds are really important. They set the theme. And that was two things that I learned from them is if you can tell a story with that picture. Oh, it's somebody getting ready to have a hearty soup lunch in winter, or oh, they're out on the deck and it's warm and airy and they're having something light. And so what you're setting up will tell the story. So that's what I learned.
No, great. Thank you. Chef Danielle, you actually, went to culinary school. You are a bona fide chef. And I heard you say that they didn't teach food styling, when you were in culinary school. However, it is so essential to the presentation.
Right.
Food. So I'm curious to know what your background and training as a chef has done to prepare you for your career in food styling.
Sure. Well, my instructor at culinary school, whenever we were doing anything, and when it came time to plate, he would always say, make it nice, make it nice. So there wasn't any kind of formal training on food styling, but they did it stressed the importance of making the food look nice. Everyone's heard that adage, we eat with our eyes long before we eat with our mouth. So it's important. And then after culinary school, I opened a personal chef service. So I was cooking in clients' kitchens for dinner parties and things like that. And again, you have to make it look nice. So it just started there. And my situation was unique. I was writing for the Food Network magazine before it was the big glossy thing it is now. It used to be an insert, like the parade insert. And my editor called and said, oh, somebody is coming down, a chef is coming down and they need a food stylist. And I gave them your name. And I'm like, I don't even know what that is. And she explained it. But of course I'm like, yeah, I'll do it. She told me what it was, and it was a TV segment. It happened to be for Rachel Ray for one of her first cookbooks, and it was a series of events and demos. And it was basically, to me, food styling is more in exercise and organization than anything, because you spend so much time doing the prep and getting everything just so that when it comes down to it, you have minutes to style your plate. So that's why I really focus on things that are kind of already pretty, so that when you don't have a lot of time, which you don't in television, when you probably know this from working with your clients, when you go to a TV station, you might have 90 seconds to get your stuff on the table if someone's using it before. So all of those things, just flexibility and being able to think quickly on your feet have been the things that have helped me the most.
And I can imagine that it would help you to work with chefs. And to your point, I've gone into television studios with clients and my chef can be frantic, because he wants food or her food, to be perfect.
Yeah.
Have that luxury, oftentimes in a space like that. So it's great that you are a chef and can understand, that process too.
Right.
I would think.
I always, when people get nervous, calm down is always the best advice. Like, it's going to be fine.
Deb, it's so interesting that you referred to what you do as creative problem solving with food. And so you've got quite a bit of experience in different aspects of journalism, photojournalism, management, and actually freelancing. I'm curious to know what your background, in a photojournalism as a photo editor has done for you now that you're often faced with styling food for your shots.
Well, I think like what I mentioned, the fact that I have to do this, it's all on the fly. I mean, I don't have the luxury of thinking about it and bringing in my own props and, doing it when the light is the best and all that kind of stuff. And that's kind of what gets me going. Sometimes it's nerve-wracking. I do get nervous before I show up because I literally don't know what I'm going to be confronted with. But the feeling of making it work while you're there, getting a picture I really like, or having, sort of all the elements come together, that's sort of the high that comes with it.
Yeah. And then you get to eat all the good stuff, I hope. Some of it?
It's a mixed bag. If I'm offered, I usually will. But I don't assume. I don't just dig in as soon as I'm done eating because, it's not necessarily for me. But often there's not really much else I can do with the food once I've played around with it. And I mean, I don't tend to, especially with chef plated food, I don't tend to move things around too much because they're presenting the food. The other thing is when I'm shooting for a newspaper or magazine, I like to make sure that the food I'm photographing is plated and presented the way that a customer is going to see it, a diner is going to see it when they show up, because otherwise they're going to look at it and say, well, what is this? You know? So, and sometimes I do see on social media that they have either replated it or it's slightly different when I shot it versus what it looks like for regular people, but I usually try and make it as close as I can.
That's a really good point. I've gotten in trouble before with a customer literally coming in with her phone and saying, this does not look like that. I want that, you know, so that's a very, very good point. In the interest of time, I do have several questions, but I'm going to go to our participants Q&A questions and share those. So this one is for you, Deb. Trisha Barba would like to know, she says, I assume that when you're shooting photos, you likely have a chef or a publicist hovering. Is that awkward at all, or does that not affect you? Thanks, Trisha.
Well, as I said, I'm usually a little bit nervous when I go in, and it depends. Normally, the publicists usually are not really hovering. They're not always there, first of all.
Say it.
No. That's the honest truth. They're usually somewhere, but they're not like over my shoulder. It's the chefs. It makes me nervous if they sit there and watch what I'm doing. But I don't usually say anything because it's their dish and I don't want to, you know, but yeah, it's always nerve-wracking to watch somebody look at you closely what you're doing. So yeah. I would probably be more nervous having another photographer watching what I'm doing than having a publicist or a chef.
Okay, thank you. I have another question from Danny Boylan. I'm a professional chef who readily acknowledges that my plating is the weakest part of my game. What books, websites, Instagram handles, etc., would you recommend to improve my plating technique? And I'll give that to any of you ladies.
Now, I would really recommend, we have a lot of our fellow doms who do great, beautiful work at this. So some of the people who come to mind for me, and I think they're all on Instagram, Lisa Cherkasky is like a food styling goddess, in my opinion. Julia Rutland, Kristen Hartke. There's a wonderful woman who is a food stylist at America's Test Kitchen called Elle Simone Scott. I would start there. There's lots of good stuff out there to look at for inspiration.
Thank you. Anybody else have anyone to add to that? And I'll move on to the next question.
Well, if he really wants to get into styling techniques, and I'm not sure that he does, there are a couple styling books. Denise Vivaldo, who is pretty much, everybody knows her, is busy all the time. And she will talk about the business of it, but I'm not sure if he's a chef, how deep into styling he wants to get. So I don't know.
All right, that's helpful. So Alan Savada would like to know, I hope we as amateurs will get some guidance on phone photography. As the new phones are so advanced with settings, etc., we need to learn how to make use of them. And I heard all of you say, you know, the arrival of the iPhone kind of changed the game a little bit. Any tips for the amateurs on phone photography?
Natural light. Because the flash on your phone is not going to do what my flash will do. Yeah. That's what keeps me employed. Yeah, I would, the best case, and the problem is, I mean, this time of year, it's not so much of an issue. And now with so much outside dining, it's even less of a problem. One of the things, a lot of the reviews I do are in the winter when it gets dark at 4 o'clock. So, you know, you just can't rely. If you're lunching or brunching, you're in good shape. Dinner is tough. Restaurants are not lit for phone photography. So your food you can bring, you can also get a lot of people, Instagrammers tend to have the little video lights that they carry with them, little square video lights that can work alongside an iPhone. But those are sort of the constraints. Yeah, I wouldn't recommend flash.
You mentioned it was changing so rapidly, I think, but one of the keys would be to go online and look and just search for some latest tips on photographing with the iPhone, because it has changed. The newer cameras will do more than the older ones, and some of the classes are for free and some are paid, but you know, it's changing so rapidly that that's the way I would do it. If I wanted to get really, really good with my phone, that's what I would do.
My recommendations, I have two. One, if you're shooting with your phone, back up. People tend to get so close to the food that there's no frame of reference for what else is on the table or what's happening. And natural light is great, but I've also had whoever I'm dining with turn on the flashlight on their phone and kind of hover it near so it brightens it up a little bit.
Yeah, good point. We do that too, as my husband rolls his eyes into the back of his head. You know, one of those kids has to turn on their flash for me to get the photo before anybody can touch their food. Okay, so Mark Donegan would like to know, is it true that photographers and stylists use mashed potatoes instead of ice cream? Ice cream for shots.
Yes. I mean, I tend to only work with food because what I hate is when I get a cookbook or see a recipe in an article and I make it and it looks nothing like the picture. And that's because the picture has been manipulated to the point that it's likely inedible. So I don't do that, but yes, that has been done.
I think that's much more common in advertising. For editorial work, for everything I do, even the stuff that I did in the studio at the Post, it was all real food.
Real food.
And yeah, ice cream is a pain to work with. But yeah, it needs to be the real thing.
Well, I think in many situations now, legally, if you are selling XYZ ice cream, it can't be, they don't usually use mashed potatoes. It's a mix of Crisco and something else. But I think there is a law now that in truth and advertising kind of thing. So I think it's becoming less common. Part of the problem is if it's a shoot where the food has to look pretty all day long, there might be models on the counter that are to hold up to show off what isn't, and it may not be real, but I think that's fading.
No. So I have a question from Tyler Westerfield for Danielle. How do you get involved with styling for news stations?
Let's see. So I told you how I got started, just kind of fell into it. But if that's something that you're interested in, find out who the producers are of the local shows. Morning shows, I think, are where most cooking segments take place, morning and afternoon. Find out who produces those shows and send them an email. You know, this is what I do, I'm available. Because sometimes especially when people are planning a book tour and they're going to numerous places, they will ask the producer at the TV station, can you recommend a food stylist in your area? So I would certainly start there.
Okay, thank you. Each of you mentioned that you have a toolkit or what is in your styling kit when you approach a shoot. What are some of those essentials? Do tell. Danielle, you mentioned that you have a kit, so I'll start with you.
Let's see, I always have a spray bottle with water because misting the food can help it looks better. And then I'll have another spray bottle with a mix of water and glycerin, just kind of like an oil. And again, it's just to add sheen to things as they start to sit. Bring paint brushes, toothpicks, cotton balls, tweezers. Those are some of the things I always have.
Yeah. And Nancy, what do you always have?
Well, one of the things that I use, I didn't mention at all, but when I'm shooting and styling, since I have to shoot as well, I use a lot of what I call them wedges, but they're actually called little photo shims. And a lot of times when you're shooting, and if people start trying some of the things that they've seen, you look at it with the camera looking right at it, and you can't see into the bowl or the plate. And that's what people want to see. We're not shooting, as a famous stylist said, you're not shooting plate, you're shooting the food. So move in to the food and tip it forward. And it's surprising that the camera doesn't seem to notice that you've actually artificially tipped it forward. And I recommend there's ones that are opaque and there are ones that are clear or almost clear. And the clear ones are better because if you're trying to prop up, you know, a glass of sorbet or a crystal goblet of champagne, and you've got this black wedge behind it, it's kind of ruins the look. I think that's pretty critical. And as Danielle said, that the bottle of water, and I always keep some little drops of oil, just vegetable oil, because if you're shooting a long time, even the prettiest, moistest looking vegetables or even a meat will get dry on top, and then you can touch them up with a little oil.
Okay. Good point. Thank you. That was Linda Davis's question, by the way. Deb, I know that, and I've seen you in action. You show up with your kit, your props, and all of your stuff. Are there certain things that you always have with you for a shoot?
I normally don't bring, I mean, other than camera gear. I mean, I have my set stuff that I bring, but I don't have a lot of that things. What I was gonna add the oil thing. Like when I'm in a restaurant and something looks a little bit dry, there's that I can ask for a little oil or a little water if I need to just make something look a little fresher. I tend to, you know, if a chef brings out a dish or brings out multiple dishes at the same time, I'll sort of figure out which one is going to be able to sit for a few minutes and not look any different. Or, you know, for a drink, you may need to mix it up a little bit. If you need to get like a little foamy head on a drink or something, you just take a straw and stir it up and you can get some bubbles going and stuff like that. But I don't actually, I'm actually writing down some of the things that Danielle said. I'm like, oh, maybe I should have some Q-tips and a little olive oil that I can take with me. Because normally I kind of rely on whatever they've got there to help me through.
Well, that's great. Someone is asking, sorry, but which restaurant in Georgetown did the chocolate souffle? I know that souffle. But somebody asked it. I wasn't going to say it.
I didn't want to, I mean, my presentation would have taken like, you know, an hour and a half if I had told a story about everything that I showed, but that was at Cut, which I'm not even 100% sure is still there.
I know. Cut by Wolfgang Puck at the Rosewood. Yes, that glorious souffle, and it will be back. Stay tuned.
Oh, good. Okay. Yeah, I wasn't sure, but yes, that's where that was from.
Stay tuned. Thank you. So Judith Maza says, I often bring a black napkin to give me a start on a black background, and also LED battery operated lighting, and then color corrected with a white balance card. What do you think of that, Deb?
Sure. I mean, I think having there are some, like when I'm not doing editorial stuff, I have some backgrounds here that I take with me because I don't know. Sometimes it's great to shoot on a white backdrop. Sometimes that's what a client wants. It's just a product shot, very clean. So if you want to bring something with you that will give you a base so that you know you have a backdrop that you like going into it. Generally for editorial work, I'm trying to incorporate the restaurant with the dishes so that I'm looking to use things that are recognizable from the restaurant in the photos. So I don't tend to go with a plain backdrop. What was the other part of that question?
She just wanted to know what you think about that.
And as far as I do have a few LED color correctable lights that I don't use them. I don't think this is totally my opinion. I don't feel like it makes the food look great. The flash to me gives a cleaner light, really makes it pop in a way that that's just a personal preference for me. So I don't tend to use a steady video light.
Thank you for that. Nancy, I have a question for you from Takira Golson. She'd like to know, she says, Nancy, how do you always make sure you're getting everything in focus that you would like to have in focus?
Well, you have to practice a lot. I mean, actually it was a revelation, which is why I mentioned it in my video. Over the years, when I knew I was stalled, I'm not getting any better, my pictures are about the same as they were, I hired a photographer a couple times to look at my pics. I should have hired Deb. Anyway, I hired somebody to say, okay, I'm going to give you 10 pics and then you just look at them and then we have an hour phone conversation and you tell me what I did wrong. And she said, well, you know, you don't seem to have the thing that should be in focus. Well, I've been doing work for like 2 or 3 years and this point of focus thing, what? And so I really think that learning to use a tripod, because then your camera is still, and then also taking the time to learn how to do it with your camera. Aperture is important, but really to me, the most important thing is to look very closely and just work with it and make sure, and then make sure that you know on your camera how to be sure that what you want is actually in focus. Maybe as hard as knowing what should be in focus. In some recipes where the berries are on the top and they're the star of the recipe, then the berry becomes the focus. But why not? And if you have a bowl of vegetables, it could be the whole top of the vegetables. Deb probably has more to say about that.
I think aperture is pretty key. For anybody that has a DSLR, I don't shoot, my food is shot at maybe f10, f11, f13, very, very small apertures, which will give you more of your picture in focus and really works well for macro focusing when you're focused on one very small specific thing.
Thank you for that. So there are lots of questions in here. I'm going to let our chat go on. I know it's a little past 3 o'clock now, but I'm going to pose a few more of these. If you guys want to stay on with us, you're welcome to. And then I'll make sure that we get some of the other questions to our panelists and we can share with you via social media, as I shared our social media handles at the top of this. So some more questions. Laura Chase would like to know, Deb, do you shoot on a tripod for your post assignments, even though you move around a lot? Do you ever shoot tethered for the post?
No and no. I do shoot tethered when I shoot. Shooting tethered means that I've got a long, usually orange cord, so that my pictures are immediately ingested into a laptop. So somebody that's with me, or I can see them large right away. I use that for portrait sessions so that people can see if they like the poses and what they look better, and if we've got what they like. I tend to use that for corporate headshots, things like that. I generally do not shoot tethered, and I don't shoot on a tripod hardly ever if I can avoid it. Part of that, I think, is just my photojournalism background. I like to move around. Like I was talking about, like looking at things from different angles. I find that if I get locked into a position in a tripod, that I feel very constrained. So yeah, I don't do either of those things.
Thank you. Danielle, I've got 2 questions for you.
Sure.
Daniel Gossard says, greetings from Indonesia. Any tips for photographing things like rendang, which is very brown and shiny like stew? Uh-oh. Did you hear me?
Broke up a little bit. No.
He says, greetings from Indonesia. Any tips for photographing things like rendang, which is brown and not very shiny like a stew? I think, Nancy, you talked about shooting brown things as well, so I'll let you 2 tackle that.
I would first start with a white bowl or a brightly colored bowl just to give some contrast, because you don't want to alter it if that's what it really looks like. But again, I would start with a white bowl. If it's not shiny, you could do a little olive oil drizzle on top just to give it some texture, but you don't have to do that if that's not how you would traditionally eat it. But a white bowl, white plate.
Yes, I think if you're shooting brown things, I can't picture the stew. I'm not familiar with it. Yeah, a white plate or a contrasting plate. But I would also try to think, if you're going to have to shoot it and make it look appetizing, or present it and make it look better, try to think of what herbs or spices or some kind of garnish. And let me say, I don't like garnishes that don't have anything to do with it. If there's not going to be any parsley in that you could eat in the dish, then I wouldn't really want to put parsley in it. That's just my rule. But that's what I would try to do. Try to figure out if you could get a napkin that adds color. And that was what I learned when we were shooting books with professionals that do books, is what can we do if the food is dull to make everything else look brighter? Napkin, plating, background.
Ingredients. You can use ingredients in the picture as well, if there's something interesting that the stew is made up out of, to broaden the picture out, so it's not just a tight shot of the dish, but something that that might add a little. Also with soups and stews, making sure that whatever the focus is, the vegetables, that they're sort of defined in the dish. like one of the hardest things to photograph is just like a really smooth soup, you know? So if you can, sometimes you can just by lifting up, like if it's a piece of meat or a piece of potato or whatever, bringing it up to the top of the dish and then photographing it, that helps with some texture as well. That might help a little bit.
Right. Along those lines, I have someone has also asked the question, what if you're a chocolatier and everything is the same size and brown? And you don't want to always have the same shots. I think some of the tips that you've all just mentioned about ingredients and spices and texture apply. Anything that you would say for our chocolatier?
Maybe think about adding color or contrast with your surfaces that you're shooting on.
Well, one of the things that is good, I mean, since I worked on a shoot and watched what the folks, the pros did on it with a chocolate book, is that the lustrous quality that you can take advantage of in some shots. If you have a glaze and you wait and shoot it when it's dulled down, you're not going to get as pretty a look as if you shoot it while it still has a bit of luster. And then, of course, if you're shooting desserts with chocolate, the swirls can hold, depending on how you do the swirls, they can hold light. And you can also arrange the camera so that you get that kind of dipping effect that shows off the light. But you're right. I mean, other than shooting, adding, like we did a cake, and okay, you got a chocolate cake there, but if you put raspberries on the top, because there's raspberries in the recipe, then you've changed the nature of what you're looking at. It's tough. It's very tough.
I agree. I think backgrounds, colorful backgrounds could really be a big help.
Thank you. So Sandra Miller asked, any tips for fire shots, barbecue, wood-fired, etc.? Has anybody had experience with that type of photography or styling?
I worked on a food stylist for a cookbook, and one of the recipes was like something flambe. I think it was like a peach, but they specifically wanted a picture of the flame. Now, of course, when you really flambe something, you can't really see. It's not like a vibrant flame. It's usually kind of blue. So we ended up taking about a dozen matches, tucking it into the back of the peach and lighting them all at the same time. So at least for a second, there was a visible flame. But the people who made that recipe are going to be very disappointed at home because it's not going to look like that. Alcohol doesn't burn that way.
Interesting. Deb, you've never had to shoot a barbecue shot or something like that?
Yeah, I have a little bit of fire experience. So like dry ice, fire is really good in food pictures. So if I've got a chef, I just did a picture like this last week of a chef at a Chinese restaurant, and a wok with fire, all good. So generally a little slower shutter speed will help you. You'll see the flames. If you, like Danielle was saying, if you get bigger flames than you might normally have, and most chefs know how to make that happen, that helps the picture as well. For most of the barbecue stuff I've done, I mean, most actual barbecue stuff isn't like a big flame situation, right. You know, like it's a grill, so it's coals, or it's, you know, so what you're seeing is the food on top of the grill, which sort of suggests barbecue. I mean, like, I don't think you would normally see big flames coming out of a barbecue grill with food on it, unless maybe the fat drippings or something. But if you slow the shutter speed down a little bit, you'll get some of that, a little more dramatic fire.
Good point. The questions keep coming in, so I'm going to ask two more, and then we're going to put the rest of them to social media and make sure that we get some of these answered. So someone has asked, actually Viviana Alvarez de la Parra would like to know, can any of you ladies talk about the use of software to correct the photographs, and what are the ones that you prefer, and any that you'd rather not use?
Well, I definitely, maybe Deb is more skilled and she doesn't need to use much photoshopping, but I use Photoshop Elements. I mentioned it in my video. The reason I use it, it's better for beginners and intermediates. As my husband said, why aren't you using, you know, the real Photoshop that's for the professionals? And I said, and then he started watching what I was doing, and he said, oh, it'll do a lot too. And the problem is, the higher grade of software that you get, the more you have to learn. and I have only mastered about maybe 25% of the Photoshop elements that I use. And so, you know, you basically won't get anything out of it unless you know how to use the software, which is in its own arena, a skill that takes a while to master. So there are lots of them. I happen to use that because it doesn't have as steep a learning curve. To me, it still had a big learning curve. But yes, I find that a lot of times, one thing that happens when you're styling in the old days, it used to be if you dropped a bit of oil on a tablecloth, the whole table had to be stripped because you couldn't spot out the dribbles on the cloth. And now with Photoshop, whatever one you're using, you can make corrections, and I make a lot of corrections, but I don't know. What about Deb?
I use Photoshop. I use regular Photoshop. I mean, it's a massive program. Like you said, I use a fraction of it. I'm not a Photoshop expert, particularly when I'm shooting for editorial. I can't add things, take out things, you know, so I don't, I can for portraits and for clients and weddings, things that are not journalism. But that's the main tool that I use. I mean, I have some importing software, Photo Mechanic, things like that that I use. But as far as making the pictures look better, some people like Lightroom. I've never been a fan of it. I use something called Capture One, which is similar. It allows me to do sort of a pre-toning of photos before I do the final JPEG toning in Photoshop. If this is getting too technical, yeah, let me know. But I also try and shoot as close to what I want the picture to look like while I'm there. So I don't want to spend 90% of my time doing post-production, fixing pictures. I don't want to do any of that. So I also shoot raw. So that allows me to tweak the color a little bit because some of these restaurants, particularly scene pictures at night, dark restaurants, no lighting, you know, they can tend to look really red or really orange. So I never get rid of it completely because it needs to reflect the feel of the restaurant. But for the food itself, especially when I'm lighting it, that sort of takes care of it. So I only have to do a very minimal amount in Photoshop.
So I have one last question. As I was watching the presentations that each of you made, it made me, one, really hungry. It also made me really miss eating out. It also made me miss going into a television studio with clients and, you know, presenting food. So in this time of COVID, I'd like to discuss a little bit how it has affected food styling and food photography. How is it affecting us now? What are your thoughts on what how it will impact and change the industry and the process going forward? I'll start with you, Danielle.
For me, I'm not doing anything right now. I have some folks who at my house are particularly vulnerable, so we are just being very careful. I'm just using this time to work on some new projects and some other things that I want to get done. But I have not been getting calls for jobs because, again, everything seems to be on hold. I mean, I hope at some point that will change, but I think that once we get past this or whatever, however this is going to all work out, I do think it'll change the way that this is done. You know,
Because it makes me curious, like when you now go into
right
studio to style,
I don't want to be packed into a room with, you know, the other 8 people who are also going to be on the show, you know, while we're waiting. So I would imagine it would have to be different.
Nancy, what are your thoughts on that?
What I have found, my work is not that much affected. I basically am working on whatever projects I'm working on. And the only thing I have noticed is, yeah, I think I'll do comfort food because it seems like more people are interested in comfort food. They're feeling bad, and so I'm doing more of that. Other than that, since my projects are driven by what I have on my agenda, which, you know, whether it's a blog post or whether I'm working on a video and I need to do something that shows a point, it's not really affecting me, but it didn't before, because that's the thing when you're DIY, the one person process, you either do it or you don't.
That's good to know. So Deb, I'm very curious. I saw in your presentation that you'd also taken photos. You said just yesterday, and I see some chefs or last week of people in masks. Tell us about your process now.
Well, originally things just disappeared, just like everybody else. I mean, I'm a freelancer, so I'm sort of at the mercy of people calling me and hiring me, and that wasn't happening. I mean, one of the godsends about the Post is newspaper still has to publish, and the restaurant industry and these changes are a top news story. So in the beginning, it was take home, photograph it here, only takeout food. Then it evolved is restaurants. I would go into restaurants. I would be the only person there besides the chef, and still photographing. If a restaurant was only doing takeout food, I would only photograph it that way. Same thing what I was talking about before about not presenting the food in a way that the customer isn't going to see it. So once the restaurants started opening up, then I was able to shoot plated food again, which was nice. But again, I'm usually the only other person in the restaurant now besides the chef. I did a story in Virginia. They reopened indoor dining before Maryland did. So I did a story where I was at two places that had opened around Tyson's Corner. And that was my first time back in restaurants with people, and it was weird. You know, they had tables roped off where people weren't allowed to sit and spaced out, and people wearing masks and stuff like that. So it's I don't know what it's going to look like when it totally comes back. I mean, I think masks are here for the foreseeable future. I think people are, you know, when we see these spikes all over the country, people are getting more and more. I don't personally, I don't have any desire to eat inside a restaurant right now. Outside, I'm generally okay. But it's even outside, it's hard to maintain that distance when a waiter is taking your order, when you know, there's all sorts of things that don't quite feel right about it for me right now.
Ladies, we're getting to the end of our conversation. Does anyone have any final thoughts, anything you'd like to share that perhaps we may have missed? And like I said, we will take the conversation on to social. Was there any last points that you want to leave with our guests that are still with us?
It's a very interesting and challenging and gratifying process. I had never done it because, as I say, I was only into the creating the recipes and the text, and boom, it's like a whole exploration. If you can actually shoot the recipe that you created instead of turning it over to a photographer who doesn't know that recipe, it's really empowering.
Thank you. Anything else, ladies? All right, I think we've talked about a lot today. I will mention one last time for all of us, if you'd like to continue the conversation, you can find at Les Dames DC is the Instagram and Twitter handle to continue with Les Dames d'Escoffier. And then you can find Nancy Baggett at Nancy_Baggett, Baggett. Chef Danielle, you can find her at Chef Danielle Turner on social media. And Deb Lindsey, I still have a bunch of questions for you about your equipment and what's in your toolkit. So you guys can find Deb at Deb Lindsey on social media, and you can find me at TAA_PR. I just want to thank each of our panelists for sharing so much knowledge with us today and your insights, and thank you to all of our guests who joined us, and wish you guys a good evening. And let's keep cooking, let's keep photographing and connecting. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Elba.
Take care.